there is a moment, and every man who has ever been in combat knows this moment, when you look across the sky and you understand, for the first time, that the enemy is not just dangerous. He is overwhelming. He is everywhere at once. His machines are faster than yours. His guns are louder than yours. And his ammunition never seems to run out. That moment does not come with a warning. It comes while you are flying at 400 miles an hour over Blue Pacific, and your hands are already on the controls. And there is no time left to be afraid, because the fear already happened 3 months ago when you read the intelligence report and told yourself it was probably exaggerated. For the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, that moment came. It did not come all at once. It came in pieces, over Guadalcanal, over the Solomons, over the Philippine Sea, until the pieces added up to something that no man in the Japanese high command was willing to say out loud, but every surviving pilot already knew in the bones of his hands and the muscles of his jaw. America had built something that Japan could not match, not just in numbers, not just in machines, in firepower, in the raw, industrial, unrelenting weight of metal that the Americans could put into the sky and keep there until there was nothing left to shoot at. This is that story. And I want to tell it to you the way those pilots lived it. From the inside, from the cockpit, from the moment of clarity when a man who had been trained since childhood to believe that spirit could overcome material began to understand that sometimes spirit is not enough. If you have never heard this story the way it was actually experienced, not from the American side, not from the history books that talk about tonnage and production numbers, then stay with me. Because what those men thought, what they wrote in their diaries, what they told each other in the pilots' barracks on the islands, is one of the most extraordinary and heartbreaking records in the entire history of air warfare. And almost no one in the West has ever really heard it. I have been studying this war for most of my adult life. I have read the debriefs. I have read the letters. I have sat with the numbers, and I have sat with the men who survived long enough to tell me what the numbers felt like from the inside of a cockpit. And I can tell you this. What the Japanese pilots experienced when they flew against American firepower in the middle years of the Pacific War was not just military defeat. It was a collision between two entirely different ideas about what war was, what machines were, and what a human being could be asked to endure. So let us go back. Let us go back to the beginning of the reckoning and follow it all the way to the end. If what I am about to tell you matters to you, if the stories of men who flew into the impossible and kept flying anyway matter to you, then do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this one, and I do not want you to miss a single one of them. The Japanese Navy Air Corps that went to war in December 1941 was, by any honest measure, one of the finest collections of aviators ever assembled on Earth. These were not men who had been drafted and given 6 months of training. Many of the veterans of the Pearl Harbor strike, men like Saburo Sakai, like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, like Tetsuzo Wamoto, have been flying and fighting since before the war with China began in 1937. They had accumulated more combat hours than almost any Allied pilot alive. They had developed techniques, formation tactics, and gunnery skills that the Americans and British would spend years trying to replicate. The standards required to enter the Japanese Naval Aviation Program were staggering. In some pre-war selection cycles, fewer than 1% of applicants were accepted. The training pipeline that followed was brutal, designed not just to produce competent pilots, but to produce something closer to an aristocracy of the air, men whose skill in the cockpit was so refined and so deeply embedded that it functioned less like a learned ability and more like a physical instinct. The men who made it through were genuinely extraordinary. They knew it. Their superiors knew it. And the men who flew against them in the early months of the war knew it too, often at the cost of their lives. The Zero, the Mitsubishi A-6M, was a genuine masterpiece of pre-war Japanese engineering. It could outmaneuver almost anything the Allies put against it in the early months of the war. It had extraordinary range, over 1,500 miles under optimal conditions, that allowed it to project Japanese air power across distances that American planners had initially considered impossible for a carrier-based fighter. It was light, responsive, and in the hands of a skilled pilot, almost supernaturally graceful in a turning fight. The men who flew it believed in it. They had earned the right to believe in it through years of practice and combat. When the Zero pilot swept over Pearl Harbor, over Malaya, over the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines, They did it with a confidence that was entirely justified by experience. The Zero was better than the aircraft it faced. The men flying it were better than the men they fought. The combination was devastating in a way that went beyond the immediate tactical results. It established, in the minds of both sides, a hierarchy, a sense of who was dominant in the air over the Pacific. That would take years and enormous blood to revise. But confidence is not the same as invulnerability. And the Japanese pilots, even in those early triumphant months, were already taking note of something that would matter enormously later. American planes were tough. Brutally, almost incomprehensibly tough. The Grumman Wildcat, the stubby, underpowered, outmaneuverable Wildcat that the Zero pilots regarded with something close to contempt as a fighting machine, could absorb extraordinary punishment and keep flying. Japanese pilots reported hitting Wildcats with multiple cannon rounds, watching pieces come off, and then watching the aircraft fly away. The self-sealing fuel tanks, the armor plate behind the pilot's seat, the firewall construction that could contain an engine fire long enough for a pilot to reach friendly lines. These were not features that Japanese aircraft designers had prioritized. The Zero had none of them. It was designed for speed, range, and maneuverability, and it achieved all three by stripping away every gram of weight that was not strictly necessary for those purposes. That included the weight that might have saved a pilot's life when the guns found him. This was not an accident or an oversight. It was a philosophy. The Japanese military tradition held that the warrior spirit, Yamato Damashii, was a more important combat asset than material protection. A pilot who needed armor plate was a pilot who was already thinking about being hit. And a pilot who was already thinking about being hit had already, in some spiritual sense, conceded the possibility of defeat. The Zero reflected this philosophy perfectly. It was a weapon designed for offense, for aggression, for the attack. It was not designed to survive being attacked. For the first year of the war, that philosophy worked. The Zero pilots had the skill and experience to avoid being hit. They had the tactical initiative. They could choose when and where to fight, and they consistently chose conditions that favored their aircraft strengths. And they won, again and again, in engagements where the disparity in pilot quality was simply too great for American industrial advantages to overcome in the short term. But then Guadalcanal happened, and Guadalcanal changed everything. The campaign for Guadalcanal, which began in August 1942 and lasted 6 grinding months, was the first sustained test of Japanese air power against prepared American defense at range. The Japanese pilots who flew into the Guadalcanal battle zone from their bases at Rabaul were not flying short missions with full fuel tanks and optimal conditions. They were flying over 500 miles each way, at the absolute edge of the Zero's range, arriving over the battle zone with barely enough fuel to fight and barely enough reserve to get home. The American pilots defending Henderson Field could fly for 15 minutes, land, refuel, and be back in a fight. The Japanese pilots had one pass, one engagement window, and then the long flight home, often in damaged aircraft, often with wounded men who would not make it back. The Wildcats that defended Guadalcanal were crewed by men who had learned from defeat, men who had been beaten over Wake Island and at Midway and in the Coral Sea, and who had gone back and thought carefully about what had gone wrong. The new American tactics, developed largely by Major John Smith and his squadrons at Henderson Field, exploited everything the Wildcat could do while minimizing what it could not. They did not try to outturn the Zero. They used altitude, speed, and diving attacks. They went for quick passes and immediate disengagement. And they had something the Japanese pilots had never really encountered before in sustained numbers: radar, ground control, and warning time. The Japanese pilots began to notice something in those months over Guadalcanal that had not been true in the Philippines or over Malaya. The Americans were waiting for them. They were not surprised. They were already at altitude when the Japanese formations arrived, already in position, already with the energy advantage that altitude gives a diving fighter. And when the Japanese pilots tried to turn and engage, the Wildcats would dive away and climb back to altitude and dive again. And the fight never developed into the kind of close maneuvering combat where the Zero's advantages could be decisive. It was, from the Japanese perspective, deeply frustrating, like fighting a man who refuses to stand still and let you hit him the way you were trained to hit. Saburo Sakai, who would survive the entire war to write one of the most extraordinary memoirs ever produced by any fighter pilot of any nation, described the change in American tactics over Guadalcanal with something that reads almost like professional admiration. They were learning. They were adapting with a speed and a systematic thoroughness that he had not anticipated. And unlike the Japanese pilots, who were losing their irreplaceable veterans in ones and twos over Iron Bottom Sound, men who could not be replaced because the training pipeline could not produce their equals in anything less than years, the Americans seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of capable young pilots who kept arriving and kept getting better with each passing month. The losses of experienced Japanese pilots over Guadalcanal were catastrophic in ways that did not show up immediately in the casualty numbers. When a veteran with 3 years of combat experience went down over the canal, the Japanese lost not just a man, but a repository of knowledge and skill and tactical judgment that had taken years to develop and could not be reconstructed on any timeline that the war would allow. When an American pilot with 3 months of training went down over Henderson Field, the Americans lost a man, a terrible loss, deeply felt by a squadron, but a replaceable one in a way that the Japanese loss was not. The structural asymmetry of those losses was invisible in the after-action reports, but devastating in its long-term consequences. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, the Japanese Navy Air Corps had lost hundreds of its most experienced pilots. Not just numbers, names. Men who had been flying since the China War. Men whose aerial gunnery was so refined that they could hit targets that other pilots could not see clearly enough to aim at. Men who had trained the next generation and who carried in their heads knowledge that had never been fully written down because it lived in the hands and the eyes and the reflexes of men who had been doing it long enough for it to become second nature. The hollow that their deaths left in the Japanese pilot corps was structural, not merely numerical, and it would never be filled. But the firepower question, the question that would come to dominate the thinking of every surviving Japanese pilot in the middle and late years of the war, had not yet fully arrived in the Guadalcanal months. That required a new machine. That required the Hellcat. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered combat in August 1943, and within weeks it had changed the fundamental arithmetic of Pacific Air War in ways that the Japanese pilots who encountered it first could feel before they could fully articulate. The Hellcat was not, in any narrow technical sense, a more elegant machine than the Zero. It was heavier, less maneuverable in a low-speed turning fight, less graceful in a way that the Zero had always been graceful, that quality of thoroughbred horse compared to a draft horse. But it was faster in a dive, dramatically faster in a climb, and it could survive damage that would have reduced a Zero to burning fragments and falling aluminum. It had 650 caliber machine guns, the standard American heavy aircraft machine gun of the period, and they were arranged to converge an optimal range that American gunnery training had been specifically designed to exploit, and it had armor and self-sealing tanks, and a pilot who, unlike his Japanese counterpart by 1943, had probably had at least a year of training and might have had 2. The Japanese pilots who first encountered the Hellcat in large numbers described the experience in terms that had never appeared in Japanese combat reports before. The word that kept recurring in various forms was overwhelming, not superior, not more capable. Overwhelming, as in, there is no calibrated response to this, as in, the number of variables has exceeded the capacity of individual skill to manage all of them simultaneously. What they meant specifically was firepower. 650 caliber guns firing simultaneously at a convergence range optimized for deflection shooting meant that an American pilot who achieved a firing position, even briefly, even imperfectly, was delivering a weight of metal that the Zero simply could not absorb and survive. Japanese pilots who had learned to absorb glancing hits from the Wildcat's guns and nurse their aircraft back to base discovered that the Hellcat's guns were not forgiving in the same way. A short burst from 650s into a Zero's wing route was not a glancing hit. It was structural failure. It was fire. It was the end of everything. And the Americans were getting better at finding those firing positions. The new training programs, the result of years of combat experience being systematically analyzed and translated into curriculum at bases across the continental United States, were producing pilots who understood deflection shooting in a rigorous, technical sense. who had practiced it thousands of times on training ranges against towed targets at varying angles, who could calculate lead angles and hold a sight picture in conditions where G-forces and adrenaline and the proximity of an enemy aircraft were all working against precision. The Japanese pilots, who had always relied on close maneuvering combat where individual artistry and long experience could compensate for imperfect geometry, were now facing an opponent who did not need to stay in a fight long enough for artistry to matter. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought in June 1944, was a moment when all these trends converged into something that the American pilots called a Marianas turkey shoot and the Japanese pilots called, in their own private vocabulary, the confirmation of everything they had feared and hoped was not true. The numbers are so extreme that they almost resist comprehension. The Japanese launched multiple strike groups totaling over 300 aircraft in the first wave alone, and the Americans destroyed over 200 of them before they reached the fleet. Japanese losses over 2 days of fighting exceeded 400 aircraft. American losses were measured in dozens. The American combat air patrols over the fleet during that battle were guided by radar and vectored by shipboard controllers who could see the entire aerial picture, every contact, every altitude, every bearing, in a way that the Japanese strike group leaders, flying without that kind of information, could not match. The Hellcat pilots were directed to the intercept points with a precision that allowed them to achieve altitude and position advantages before the Japanese pilots even knew the intercept was developing. And when the engagements began, the weight of fire that the Hellcats could deliver was simply beyond the capacity of the Japanese formations to survive in anything like their original strength. The Japanese pilots who survived long enough to turn back toward their carriers had to fly home with the knowledge that most of their comrades had not survived, and that nothing in the sky over the Philippine Sea, no tactic, no maneuver, no act of individual courage or skill, had been able to stop what had happened to them. The men who made it back and wrote about what they had seen described an experience that no language of warrior tradition had prepared them for. They had gone into battle with skill and courage, and the absolute conviction that those things were enough. They had discovered that they were not. What the Japanese pilots wrote and said after the Philippine Sea makes for some of the most sobering reading in the literature of Pacific War. Not because they were broken. Many of them were not, in the way that word is usually meant, but because they had achieved something that is very difficult for any professional warrior to achieve. A clear-eyed, unsparing assessment of an impossible situation, arrived at not through philosophical reflection, but through direct physical experience of what those American guns could do. A series of debriefs conducted by Japanese Naval Aviation Staff officers with returning pilots after the battle produced a document that is extraordinary in its clinical precision. The pilots were asked systematically and repeatedly about American tactics, American aircraft performance, and American gunnery. What emerged from those debriefs was a portrait of an enemy who had, in the space of roughly 2 years, completely transformed himself in ways that the Japanese strategic planners had not fully anticipated. The Americans who had been flying at Pearl Harbor had been, in the assessment of most Japanese veterans, inferior in skill, if not always in equipment. The Americans who were flying Hellcats over the Philippine Sea in June 1944 were not inferior to the Japanese in any meaningful respect, and in certain specific areas, particularly in the coordinated use of radar-guided interception and in the exploitation of ground and shipboard control systems, they were demonstrably, measurably, undeniably superior. The gunnery question kept coming up in those debriefs with an insistence that tells you how deeply it had registered in the surviving pilots. Again and again, men described the same essential experience. A brief engagement in which an American aircraft achieved a firing position, and the result was immediate, catastrophic structural damage to Japanese aircraft. The pilots were not describing near misses. They were not describing damage that had to be nursed back to base. They were describing their wingmen simply ceasing to exist in the air beside them, aircraft that had been flying and fighting one moment and were in fragments the next. The weight of fire from 650 caliber guns at close range was something that no Zero pilot had a vocabulary adequate to describe, because nothing in their previous experience had prepared them for it. But the firepower problem was not only about the aircraft guns. By 1944, the Americans had deployed a weapon that would transform the anti-aircraft problem in ways that even the most pessimistic Japanese planner had not fully envisioned: the proximity fuse. This was a radio-controlled shell, that detonated automatically when it came within lethal range of an aircraft, without requiring the nearly impossible precision of a direct hit on a moving target at high altitude. The proximity fuse had been developed through an extraordinary collaborative scientific effort by American and British researchers, and by 1944 it had been distributed to the fleet in sufficient quantities to fundamentally change the nature of what flying through a defended fleet formation meant. Japanese pilots who survived attacks on American fleet formations in 1944 described the anti-aircraft fire in terms that are almost impossible to reconcile with their descriptions of the same basic situation in 1942. In 1942, American anti-aircraft fire had been formidable but survivable with skill and speed and a certain amount of good fortune. There were angles of approach and altitudes and speeds that gave a determined pilot a reasonable probability of reaching his release point. By 1944, the pilots were describing something that did not have clear lanes through it in the way that previous defenses had. The proximity fuse shells were exploding at the right altitude, at the right moment, in patterns that did not require precise targeting of the specific aircraft. The sky around American task force in 1944 was not a gauntlet that skill and determination could run. It was a wall, a moving, adaptive, electronically orchestrated wall of exploding metal. The testimony of the kamikaze pilots, the men who volunteered for the special attack units organized in the fall of 1944, is particularly illuminating on this point, because the kamikazes were drawn largely from among the surviving experienced pilots, the men who had enough flight hours and enough combat knowledge to actually reach a target under the fire that was waiting for them. What those men said to each other in the evenings before their missions about American firepower is preserved in letters and diaries that were collected and archived after the war. They were not, most of them, broken men in the clinical sense. They were thoughtful men who had thought very carefully about what they were going to face and had made decisions that require an entirely different cultural context than the Western one to fully understand. But they had no illusions about what was waiting for them. They had seen it from a distance. Some of them had flown through it and come back at least once, and they described what they had seen with the precision and the specificity of professionals, because that is what they were. What they described was not simply quantity, not just a lot of guns firing a lot of shells. The kamikazes did not die because there were too many guns. They died because the guns were accurate, coordinated, supplied with an apparently inexhaustible amount of ammunition, and embedded in a detection and fire control system that could track multiple inbound contacts simultaneously and allocate defensive resources across the entire threat picture in real time. American destroyers on the picket lines were firing tens of thousands of rounds per hour during the heaviest kamikaze attacks. The combat information centers on the carriers were tracking dozens of contacts simultaneously and vectoring fighter intercepts to engage inbound aircraft before they ever came within gun range of the fleet. The entire air defense system was integrated, electronically, organizationally, tactically integrated, in a way that had no precedent in any previous naval conflict, and that no Japanese military planner in 1941 had imagined Americans could build and sustain from ships at sea while simultaneously fighting a war across half the Pacific. Some kamikazes got through. Enough of them got through to sink escort carriers and destroy destroyers, and inflict casualties that, in absolute numbers, were genuinely staggering. The men who planned the special attacks were not delusional about their tactical effectiveness under the right conditions. But the ones who got through because of specific favorable geometries on specific days, whether that reduced radar range or attack angles that briefly saturated a particular sector of the defense, or simple statistical variance in the system, where enough attempts will always produce some successes regardless of the baseline probability. The ones who died, and the vast majority of them died because the system built to stop them had achieved a level of integration and a sustained weight of firepower that individual skill and individual determination and individual courage could not overcome. Not sometimes. Reliably, systematically, with a consistency that told you it was not luck. This is the part of the story that the history books sometimes fail to convey with the weight it deserves. We tend to think of the kamikazes as a symbol of fanaticism or desperation, and in one important sense they were both of those things. But in another sense, a sense that the surviving pilots themselves understood clearly, they were the rational military response of a force that had concluded through direct empirical experience that conventional attack against the American fleet had become so costly that it was no longer viable as a sustainable tactical approach. If an experienced pilot flying a conventional strike mission had a probability of reaching the release point that had fallen to somewhere around 30%, and was then extremely likely to be destroyed on retirement even if the strike succeeded, because the anti-aircraft fire was now dense enough that a retiring attacker was nearly as vulnerable as an approaching one. If those were the actual numbers, and the pilots who had survived conventional missions knew that they were close to the actual numbers, then the calculus of special attack was not the product of irrational fanaticism. It was a response to a real tactical situation. And the real situation was that American firepower had been built to a point that conventional Japanese military aviation could not penetrate and survive at an operationally sustainable rate. The men who flew the last conventional strike missions in defense of the Japanese home islands in the spring and summer of 1945, men who were not kamikazes, who were flying ordinary tactical sorties against the B-29 formations and the carrier raids, described the American air presence over Japan in language that sounds more like a description of natural disaster than military opposition. The P-51 Mustangs flying escort for the B-29s had range that Japanese pilots had genuinely not believed possible for a single-engine piston fighter. It violated their understanding of what the engineering of such aircraft permitted. The Hellcats and Corsairs flying off the carriers appeared over Japanese airfield at altitudes and in numbers that the Japanese early warning network, degraded by years of attrition and resource shortages, could not reliably detect in time to scramble an effective interception. And when Japanese pilots got into the air and found the Americans, what happened was almost never competitive in the sense that the word implies two roughly equal forces. It was something else. Something that the surviving pilots struggled to describe without using language that would have been unacceptable to say too loudly in an official context. The surviving Japanese pilots of 1945 were not the heirs of Sakai and Nishizawa and Iwamoto. They were young men, some of them barely adults, with a few months of abbreviated training, flying aircraft that were being outperformed in almost every category by American machines flown by Americans who had a year or two of training and the accumulated combat experience of continuous operations from Guadalcanal forward. The results of engagements between these two populations were not competitive. They were, as often as not, massacres. The young Japanese pilots died in large numbers, and they died quickly, and the men who sent them up knew what was going to happen and sent them anyway, because there was nothing else to send. The survivors of those last months, and there were not many, wrote about American firepower with a specificity that tells you they had thought about it a great deal and from multiple angles. They did not write about it as an abstraction, as a set of production statistics, or a reflection of industrial capacity. They wrote about the guns, the specific guns on specific aircraft, the Corsair 650s, the Hellcat 650s, the Mustang 650s, the pattern and the density and the accuracy of the fire. They wrote about comrades who had been shot down not in extended dogfights that gave skill a chance to express itself, but in the initial pass, the first burst, because the American gunnery had become precise enough and the firepower concentrated enough that the first engagement was often the final one. What those pilots understood, and what the post-war history sometimes smooth over in their focus on strategic factors and production numbers, is that firepower is not only a technical and material problem, it is a psychological one. And the psychology matters in ways that compound and accelerate the material disadvantage. A pilot who knows his aircraft cannot absorb fire, who knows from observation experience that any solid hit is likely to be fatal, that there is no armor plate and no self-sealing tank between him and the bullet that finds him, flies differently than a pilot who knows his aircraft can take damage and keep flying. He is more defensive at the margins of every decision. He is less willing to hold a firing position when he is receiving return fire. He makes choices in fractions of seconds that prioritize survival over pressing the attack. These choices are not irrational. They are the correct response to the actual risk environment, but they degrade the aggregate effectiveness of the force in ways that are real and cumulative and difficult to compensate for through any amount of training or exhortation. The Zero pilots had always known, at some level, that their aircraft was fragile, and they had compensated for that fragility through skill and aggressive tactics, and a philosophy of engagement that minimized their exposure time. Attack, disengage. Attack again from a new angle. Never stay in the beaten zone long enough for the enemy to correct his aim. That philosophy worked when the Japanese pilot could control the geometry of the engagement, when he could choose the altitude and the angle and the timing of his attack. By 1944 and 1945, the American pilots were skilled enough and their machines were fast enough, and the radar and control systems were good enough that the Japanese pilots could no longer guarantee favorable geometry. They could not always choose when to fight and when to disengage. And in a fight where they did not have that geometric advantage, the fragility of their aircraft was not a manageable risk. It was a death sentence. There's a letter written by a Japanese naval aviator in the summer of 1944, after the Philippine Sea, addressed to a friend who was still in Japan. That captures his experience more precisely than any official document. The letter was never sent. The pilot was killed before he could send it. It was found among his effects and preserved by a family member who understood its value. In it, he describes a specific engagement in which he was the only survivor of a formation of 6 aircraft. He does not write about the Americans with hatred. He writes about them with something more complicated than that, a kind of appalled professional respect. The recognition one craftsman has for another who has mastered a shared craft to a degree that makes the first craftsman's own mastery inadequate to the situation. He writes that the American guns were not lucky. They were not random or scattered. They were aimed and controlled, and the pilots behind them knew what they were doing. And the result was that 5 of his friends ceased to exist in the space of perhaps 90 seconds. He writes that he does not understand how a democracy, a country that everything he had been taught told him was soft, individualistic, incapable of the sustained collective sacrifice required for real military effectiveness, had built something like this. He writes that perhaps what he was taught about America was not accurate. That question, how had America built this, occupied the minds of Japanese military planners and surviving pilots for the last 2 years of the war. The answers they arrived at were, in some respects, correct. American industrial capacity, American logistics, American training infrastructure, American electronic technology, the industrial military system that had been building toward this moment since at least 1940, if not earlier. But there was another answer, one that Japanese military culture made it structurally difficult to articulate clearly, which was this. The Americans had built a system that treated individual pilots as components of a larger collective enterprise rather than as irreplaceable warrior spirits upon whose personal excellence the outcome depended. And that system had turned out to be more effective at the specific, concrete work of killing enemy aircraft and surviving enemy guns than the approach that centered individual excellence. Not despite its impersonality, but in some important ways because of it. The American approach to aircrew training was, from the Japanese perspective, almost incomprehensibly wasteful of individual potential. The Americans trained far more pilots than any given operation required. They accepted a significant attrition rate in training as a normal cost of the business of producing large numbers of competent aviators quickly. They continuously rotated pilots through combat tours and back to training commands, so that their hard-won combat experience could be analyzed, systematized, and converted into curriculum for the men coming behind them. The Japanese approach treated every experienced pilot as a precious and irreplaceable individual asset, was reluctant to accept training casualties, and was reluctant to rotate combat veterans out of front line, even when doing so might have improved the overall quality and quantity of the pipeline. The result was exactly what you would predict from those 2 different approaches. Japan had a small number of extraordinary pilots at the beginning of the war, and a steadily declining average quality, as casualties removed the irreplaceable ones. America had a mediocre average quality at the beginning, and a steadily rising quality, as the training system incorporated the lessons of each successive campaign, and produced more graduates with better preparation. The firepower story and the pilot quality story are inseparable, and the Japanese pilots who survived long enough to observe the arc of both understood that the connection between them was not coincidental. The American guns were devastating not only because of their mechanical specifications, but because of the quality of the pilots who were using them. A Hellcat 650 caliber guns were only as effective as the pilot's ability to achieve a firing position and hold it long enough to deliver a lethal concentration of fire. By 1944, the American pilots were consistently better at that specific skill than their Japanese opponents. because the American training system had identified that skill as critical, had developed specific instructional methods to teach it, and had put large numbers of students through those methods with enough repetition to build genuine competence. The guns and the pilots had been developed together as parts of a single integrated system, and the system was more than the sum of its parts. This is what the Japanese pilots could not quite say in their official debriefs. With the language of Yamato Damashi, I still constrained what could be expressed directly, but could say in their private writing that what had defeated them was not a machine. It was a system that produced pilots and machines and tactics and logistics and electronics in quantities and qualities that the Japanese system could not match at any point after mid-1943, and that had been building that capacity for years before the war, and had only accelerated once the war began and the stakes became clear to everyone in America. The Zero pilots had been better than their opponents in 1941 because individual excellence can temporarily overcome systemic disadvantage. But individual excellence has ceilings, and by the time those ceilings were reached, the gap between the systems had become wide enough that no amount of individual heroism or refinement of spirit could bridge it. Saburo Sakai, who lost a sight in one eye over Guadalcanal and flew blind in that eye for the rest of the war, and survived everything and lived into his 80s and gave interviews and wrote his memoir with an honesty that is remarkable in any military tradition, said something in his later years that I have thought about for a long time. He said that the American pilots he faced in 1944 and 1945 were not the same kind of opponent as the men he had fought in 1942, not just better equipped. Fundamentally different in the way they approach combat, in the way they use information and coordination and the machines they were given. He said that the change in them over those 2 years was the most impressive military transformation he had ever witnessed. And he had witnessed, from the inside, both the peak of Japanese naval aviation's power and its complete destruction. He also said, and this matters, and I do not want to pass over it quickly, that the Japanese pilots were never cowards. They never stopped flying when the odds became impossible. They flew through things that should have kept them on the ground, and they flew through those things repeatedly, and many of them flew until they ran out of time. Whatever the system that produced them had failed to give them, adequate aircraft in sufficient numbers, adequate training infrastructure, adequate logistics and supply, it had given them courage in quantities that no fair witness could minimize or dismiss. Sakai, who had fought beside them and watched them die in numbers that would have broken most men's hearts, was not a man to minimize anything about them. But courage, in the end, is not the deciding variable when a material and systemic gap is large enough. And that was the thing that the Japanese pilots, in their letters and their diaries and their debriefs and their post-war memoirs, kept returning to with the relentlessness of men who are trying to understand something that resists understanding, not the absence of courage, the limits of courage, the specific and concrete and heartbreaking point at which 650 caliber guns firing simultaneously at close range exceeded the capacity of courage and skill and spirit and experience and every other individual virtue to compensate for mechanical fragility and systemic disadvantage. That point existed. The Americans had found it, and once it was found and confirmed and proven again and again in the skies over the Pacific, there was no going back to the world where it had not been found. That is the story of what the Japanese pilots really thought about American firepower. It is a story about the collision of two completely different ideas about what war is and what decides it. It is a story about systems and individuals, about production and spirit, about the specific and terrible mathematics of aerial combat in the industrial age. And it is, above everything else, a story about men, not statistics, not production figures. Men who flew into something that they could not defeat, who understood that they could not defeat it, and who kept flying anyway, because that was what they had been made to do and because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not something they were capable of. I have never been able to read those letters and those diaries without something I can only describe as a complicated grief. Not a simple grief, a complicated one. Grief for the Americans they killed, because they killed many Americans before the end. Grief for the Americans who killed them, because killing that many people over that many years leaves something in a man that does not wash out. And grief for the Japanese pilots themselves, for the waste and the tragedy and the terrible clarity with which the survivors understood, by the end, exactly what happened to them and why and what it meant for everything they had believed. They were not ignorant men. They were not fanatics who had lost a capacity for honest assessment. They were professionals who saw very clearly indeed, and what they saw was that the world had changed faster than any individual could change to meet it, and that the distance between what they had been trained to believe and what they were experiencing in the sky over the Pacific was a distance that could not be closed by any act of will or any refinement of spirit. There is one more thread in the story that I want to pull before we reach the end, because it is a thread that connects everything else together, and without it the picture is not complete. That thread is the question of what the Japanese pilots did with what they knew. What a man does when he understands with absolute clarity that the thing he is being asked to do cannot be done, not because he lacks courage or skill, but because the physics of the situation have moved beyond what any individual can overcome. That question does not have one answer. It had as many answers as there were men who faced it. Some of them withdrew into a kind of deliberate not knowing. They flew and they fought, and they did not think too carefully about the arithmetic, because the arithmetic led to places that were incompatible with getting back in the cockpit the next morning. This is not denial in the clinical sense. It is something closer to a professional discipline, the ability to compartmentalize what you know and what you feel, so that neither one contaminates your performance at the moment when performance is all that matters. Every combat pilot of every nation who has ever flown enough missions has developed some version of this capacity. The Japanese pilots had it in abundance, perhaps because their training had always emphasized the subordination of the individual emotional and rational response to the demands of duty. Some of them found a different kind of resolution in the intensity of the fighting itself. There is a quality of attention that extreme danger produces, a narrowing and sharpening of consciousness to the single immediate problem that some men find, paradoxically, clarifying. In the cockpit, with the guns and the geometry and the seconds counting down to engagement, the larger questions disappeared. There was only the aircraft, the sky, the enemy, and the next decision. Pilot accounts from every air force in the Second World War described this experience in similar terms, and the Japanese accounts are no different. The fear and the grief and the awareness of impossible odds were real, and they were there, but they were there in the moments before and after the fighting. During the fighting, there was only the fighting. And some of them simply decided, in a way that men sometimes decide things without making a formal decision, that the only thing left worth doing was to do the thing as well as it could possibly be done for as long as they were alive to do it. Not because it would change the outcome, not because they believed their individual excellence could alter the trajectory of the war, but because to do it badly, to fly carelessly, to aim imprecisely, to disengage when pressing the attack was what the situation called for, would have been a betrayal of something they could not betray and still remain themselves. This is not the same as fanaticism, though it can look like fanaticism from the outside. It is something older and more austere than fanaticism. It is the craftsman's ethic applied to the most extreme possible circumstances. Do the work well, because doing it well is what you are. These different responses coexisted in the Japanese pilot corps through the last 2 years of the war, sometimes in the same man on the same day. The diary entries and letters that survive from this period reflect all of them. The deliberate not knowing, the clarity found in the intensity of combat, the commitment to excellence as its own justification. What almost none of them reflect is self-pity. The Japanese pilots of the middle and late war were not writing from a place of self-pity. They were writing from a place of clear-eyed engagement with their situation. And the situation was terrible, and they knew it was terrible, and they wrote about it that way. The absence of self-pity in those documents is one of the most striking things about them. The Americans who fought them noticed the same quality. Veterans of the Pacific Air War, American pilots who flew against the Japanese from Guadalcanal through the end, described their opponents in the later years of the war with respect that was not diminished by the fact that those opponents were losing. They noticed that the young Japanese pilots of 1944 and 1945, despite their abbreviated training and their inferior machines, kept attacking. They kept pressing the engagements when any rational calculation of their survival probability should have told them to break off. They did things that were tactically unwise because the alternative, to fly without maximum commitment, to hold anything back, to make the calculation of survival priority over the demands of the mission, was not something they were capable of doing. The Americans respected that. Many of them said so in their debriefs and their memoirs, without any sense of contradiction, with their absolute determination to kill those same pilots before those pilots could kill them. That tension, respect, and lethal intent simultaneously held is one of the distinctive emotional signatures of the Pacific Air War as experienced by the men who fought it. It is present in the American accounts, and it is present in the Japanese accounts, and it tells you something important about the nature of professional military conflict that is easy to lose sight of when the story is told entirely in terms of strategy and production. The men in the cockpits knew each other, in the specific sense that professionals who share demanding craft know each other across the lines that divide them. They recognize each other's skill. They recognize each other's courage. And they tried to kill each other with everything they had, every time they met, because that was what the war required. And the war was real. What the Japanese pilots carried home from all of this, the ones who were fortunate enough to carry anything home, was not simple. It was not the clean sorrow men who fought well and lost fairly. It was something more complicated and more difficult to name. It was the experience of having believed, completely and without reservation, in something that the war then demonstrated was not sufficient. Not wrong, exactly. The belief in the warrior spirit as a military asset was not simply wrong. It had been right enough, real enough, operationally effective enough in the early months to justify the belief. But it had turned out to be insufficient when measured against a sufficiently large and sufficiently well-organized material and technical advantage. And the insufficiency of a belief you have given everything to is a particular kind of devastation that leaves marks that a man carries for the rest of his life, whether the life is long or short. Saburo Sakai carried those marks for over 50 years after the war ended. He wrote about them. He spoke about them in interviews. He never pretended that the loss was smaller than it was, or that the Americans had won through luck or through factors that the outcome could have been different. He was too honest for that kind of comfort and too proud to seek it. He said, in his later years, that the Pacific War had taught him things about the limits of individual human excellence that no other experience could have taught him, and that those lessons, though they had cost him more than he could calculate, were real and worth having. He did not say this with happiness. He said it with the quiet gravity of a man who has thought about something for a very long time and has arrived at a position that he can hold without flinching, not because it is comfortable, but because it is true. That is where I want to leave this story. Not with the production numbers or the tactical analysis or the body count, though all those things are part of the truth, but with Sakai in his later years, and with the pilots whose names we no longer remember but whose letters and diaries we can still read, and with the question they lived inside for the last years of their war. What does a man do when he understands that the thing he is being asked to do is beyond what any individual can accomplish, and he does it anyway? Not from ignorance, not from delusion, from something that is, in the end, both more and less than reason, and that the Japanese language has better words for than English does, and that every man who has ever been in that particular position understands without needing explained. That distance is worth thinking about today, long after the war is over and the aircraft have rusted into history, not as a lesson about Japanese culture or American industry, specifically, as a lesson about the nature systems, about the limits of individual excellence, about what happens when the gap between two approaches to organizing collective human effort becomes wide enough that the individual human being, no matter how extraordinary, no matter how willing, cannot bridge it alone. The Japanese pilots found that lesson at the wrong end of 650 caliber guns in the sky over the Philippine Sea in the summer of 1944. The finding of it cost them everything. It cost the Americans a great deal too, though a great deal less, and the world that came after it. The world we are living in now was shaped in part by what those men discovered about the relationship between the individual and the system, about the limits of spirit as a substitute for material, about the specific geometry of industrial war. Those lessons did not end with the war. They are still being learned. I want to say one more thing before we close, because it is something that deserves to be said plainly and not glossed over in the momentum of a conclusion. The Japanese pilots were not the villains of the story. They were not, as a category, the men who started the war, or the men who made the decisions that led to the systematic brutalities for which the Japanese military of the Second World War is rightly condemned by history. They were aviators. They were professionals in a specific, dangerous, demanding craft who served a government and a military system that asked terrible things of the nations it fought and of the men it sent to fight. That distinction matters. It does not absolve the system they served. But it matters in a way that all human distinctions matter, because the alternative is to reduce every man in a uniform to a symbol, and symbols do not write letters home, and symbols do not feel the weight of impossible odds from inside a cockpit that is on fire, and symbols do not carry the memory of 5 friends who were there 90 seconds ago and are not there now. Those men were real. Their courage was real. The specific physical, technical experience of flying against American firepower in 1944 and 1945 was real in a way that no summary can fully capture. The best way to honor the dead of any war, on any side, is to understand what they actually experienced, not what we wish they had experienced or what is convenient for our existing narratives. What the Japanese pilots actually experienced was complicated and terrible, and sometimes even beautiful, in a way that extreme skill and extreme danger together can produce something that has no adequate name. It deserves to be understood as it was, not as something simpler or more comfortable. Read those letters if you can find them. Read them carefully and take your time with them. Do not skim them the way we skim things now. Quickly, looking for the highlight and the takeaway. Sit with the specific language. Notice how a man who has been trained to suppress his individual emotional response his entire professional life still finds ways to let what he is actually feeling come through in the space between sentences. Notice how precisely they describe the technical details, the angles and the speeds and the guns, and how that precision is itself a kind of emotional management, a way of staying the factual and the concrete when the alternative is to face something that the factual and concrete cannot fully contain. And notice how, beneath all of it, beneath the training and philosophy and professional discipline, there is just a man writing in the only hours he has to himself, try to put into words something that he knows may never reach anyone who can understand it. That is where the whole story lives. Not in the production statistics. In those hours. In those words. In that impossible attempt to be understood across a distance that the war had made. Remember that. Because every story we tell about these men, every letter, every diary entry, every debrief and memoir and testimony, is also a story about that lesson, about what it costs to learn it, about what it means to be the one who flies into the impossible, knowing it is impossible. Because you are made to fly and there is nothing else left to do. Stay with that thought. And if this story stayed with you, if these men matter to you the way they matter to me, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and I will see you in the next one.